Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are going to be discussing the course on social policy. Within social policy, the specific module under discussion is Public Works Program. My name is Sohini Sengupta and I am a faculty in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. In this module, we shall discuss key aspects of Public Works Program implemented by the Government of India. The objective is to understand Public Works Program through examples such as Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Program, National Rural Employment Program, Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Program, Jawahar Rozgar Yojana, and the MGNREGA Act. It is important to learn about these programs in order to understand how public works are designed to be both welfare programs as well as strategies of empowerment. The objectives of the module is to enable students to understand the concept of Public Works Program, discuss the goals and objectives of public works, understand its linkages with rural poverty and right to work, discuss key public work programs initiated by government in the past. Let's start with a discussion about what is public work. So far in the social policy module, we've learned about normative ideas behind social policy. We've learned about the goals of social policy. We've learned about different ways in which social policy is created through social protection measures, social risk management, and so on. Public works is an example of a social protection strategy. It's traditionally been called, it is sometimes also called, especially in the United States, workfare. It's a program that creates temporary employment by government in times of macroeconomic shocks, conflicts, rural distress, or other kinds of other times when there's generally a loss of income faced by a large section of the population. The output of a public works program is twofold. First, the idea is to create jobs of short duration or of a temporary nature for workers so that their incomes are increased. The second one is the creation of public goods in the form of new infrastructure or improvement of infrastructure or delivery of services. The outcomes of public works program are inputs. On one hand, there are inputs such as wages in cash or kind, managerial cost and material cost that needs to be invested. The outputs are expected to lead to three final outcomes: increased income and consumption smoothing, reduction in poverty and poverty gap ratio, and infrastructure development. The understanding is that when people do not have adequate means of livelihood, when their incomes and sources of employment are variable, when their incomes are fluctuating, or when their incomes have stopped completely, then it's likely that people are going to fall into poverty, and if they're poor, they're going to stay poor for a very long time. The idea is for government to step in during such times with public work programs which generates temporary employment in order for people to be able to obtain small incomes that maintains their living standards. One of the byproducts of such public work programs in which people contribute their labor in return for cash or food transfers is to develop local infrastructure, which again could be then used by people for a variety of purposes. Usually schools, hospitals, roads, agricultural fields, etc. are created or maintained through the labor provided by people in public works program. What is it that public works is supposed to do? Many countries have introduced public works program with diverse objectives, primarily to protect from large covariate shocks such as natural disasters, macro crisis, or seasonal labor demand shortfall. A good example is the context of agriculture in India, which does not produce more than 100 to 200 days of wage work in an entire year. In particular parts of India where cultivation is primarily rain-fed, agricultural workers might face long periods of joblessness, and if they're unable to migrate to cities or find alternate source of livelihoods in such conditions, they might get poorer and their consumption might suffer. To protect people from these kinds of shocks, public works programs which are opened in the locality where the agricultural workers might be living would help them to deal with these contingencies which are inbuilt in the kind of economy in which they are inhabiting. It also protects households who might have lost their jobs due to various other reasons, but usually reasons which are not to do with their own something that they have done themselves. It also helps to fight against poverty or to help the poor gain more temporary employment. Historically, public works programs have been used by countries, wealthier countries in the north, such as the United States in the 1930s and Germany in the 1940s, to reconstruct various types of public goods and services and provide employment to people who need it in the wake of the war. India and Bangladesh are the two countries who have used public workfare programs extensively to fight against chronic poverty and drought, and to address the work shortage that invariably affects agricultural workers during lean agricultural seasons. Public work has also become an important conduit to deliver humanitarian assistance in post-disaster situations and in conflict areas where work needs to be created to ameliorate immediate distress. In the aftermath of cyclones or earthquakes or hurricanes, when people may have lost access to their livelihood and the economy, local economy has been destroyed, during those times humanitarian assistance groups often create public works programs so that cash or kind may be returned and transferred through some form of a social protection measure in order for them to be able to recover some semblance to the lives that they're used to lead. In some countries in Latin America, public works programs have been launched in recent years to address macroeconomic crisis. One example of such a country is Argentina. Public works program in the context of India is essentially means rural works. It focuses on rural workers and in rural areas, and these are special programs that create short-term work in times of seasonal food scarcity, crop failure, natural disaster or chronic poverty. They are best understood as kind of subsistence support, which essentially means that by undertaking to participate in public works program, members of rural community will not necessarily better themselves, but they may be able to immediately protect themselves from extreme types of hardship. The objective of public works program is also to create productive community assets such as rural infrastructure and regenerate local natural resources to make rural livelihoods viable and more sustainable in the future. The broader goals of public works essentially are, and we also should look at some of the characteristics of public works program, that being self-selective, it's only the most distressed who would choose to participate in public works program which involve manual work in exchange for very small transfers in cash or kind. One of the benefits of this aspect or this facet of public works program is the problem of selecting the wrong beneficiaries, the problem of the benefits going to the elites, the problem of exclusion errors reduces tremendously when only those who are most in distress are likely to choose an social protection program which involves them to contribute manual work. When supported by law, these programs become rights-based such that government is bound to start work or projects on demand by people who are in distress. Public works programs can grow beyond providing work and building assets, therefore, into a tool for community mobilization around basic rights and entitlements. To take an example of few public works programs that have been implemented in India for a really long time as part of the broader strategies to combat poverty. Food for Work program is an example of a public or rural works program that was undertaken by the government of India in the 1970s. Essentially, Food for Work programs focused on drought-prone areas where people suffered great hardship from loss of work and also food insecurity during agricultural drought years. The Food for Work aimed to create rural employment and durable assets such as irrigation, tank, panchayat and school buildings, roads and drainage during lean agricultural period. Workers were paid in food grains drawn from the buffer stock. We've already learned about the buffer stock in the module on agrarian issues and the module on food security. The program helped to stabilize wages and check rise in price of food grains in drought year. The other program that we should mention here is the Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Scheme. Introduced in the 1983 under the 6th Plan, the objective of the Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Program, RLEGP, which was a centrally sponsored scheme, was to provide work for landless households in rural areas. The understanding was that landless rural households usually face even greater distress than farming households who had some assets like cattle or land. Landless, on the other hand, were entirely dependent on selling their labor in order for them to maintain their living standards. And in distress years, these would be the households who would lack access to food and lack access to income. Rural Landless Employment Guarantee aimed to provide work to one member of rural landless households for 100 days in a year and also to create durable assets. Funds for work project were demarcated for specific activities such as social forestry, which would benefit the more disadvantaged sections of the rural community like scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and it was also used to build public housing under social programs like the IAY. Another example of a public works program is the NREP. National Rural Employment Program was a centrally sponsored scheme, again aimed at providing wage employment in the lean agricultural months to assetless rural poor. They included, apart from landless people, also marginal farmers and below poverty line families. So if you notice, what is happening between the RLEGP and NREP is the expansion of the scope of the public works so that more disadvantaged people, more categories of disadvantaged people are being included for protection. As part of its NREP contribution, the central government again provided food grains from the buffer stock to be used as wages in the employment program. States were encouraged to procure locally produced grains in order to protect local farmers and keep stable food supplies in the region. So therefore, the NREP objective was twofold. On one hand, it was to provide people with temporary employment, and the second was to help farmers by ensuring that the grains produced locally get procured and get used up in public programs so that they don't have to sell it under distress sale situations at a very low cost. Contractors were to be eliminated from rural works, and for the first time a larger role was given to local panchayat institutions to implement the program, which also meant that slowly the government was decentralizing some aspects of the delivery and implementation of large-scale social programs like public works. Works to be given priority under NREP included social forestry, soil and water conservation, irrigation, flood protection, construction and improvement of village tanks and ponds, building up school and dispensaries, and works to improve hygiene and sanitation in rural areas. In 1989, RLEGP and NREP were merged to form the Jawahar Rozgar Yojana (JRY). The objective was to provide gainful employment for unemployed and underemployed rural persons and sustainable livelihoods through the creation of rural assets and infrastructure. Center and state shared costs of the program at 80:20 ratio, and village panchayats were made responsible for implementing the program. Under JRY, priority was to be given to below poverty line, SC and ST, and free bonded labor households, and 30% of the work was to be reserved for women. Therefore, if we compare now RLEGP, NREP, and JRY, the progress in thinking in social programming that has happened as the decades progressed was a special recognition of social inequality based on gender and caste status that exists in rural societies, and therefore not use strictly economic or strictly occupational criteria for selecting beneficiaries for the delivery of social programs. JRY was implemented by the panchayats at the village, block and district level, and the ratio of expenditure was 70:15:15 respectively. From 1990-91 to 2001, 351 billion rupees were spent on JRY and 7.6 billion person days of work were created. A total of 190.28 million man days were generated up to November 1998 with an expenditure of 1,244 crores of rupees. Gains from JRI. Groups who have evaluated, observers, groups and scholars who have evaluated the JRY have tabulated some of the gains that emerged from the implementation of this program. TRY was highly effective in drought years that successively occur in the context of India. It protected people against labor market shocks and harvest failures. It helped in the empowerment of panchayats and helped in the creation of rural assets. An important scheme that emerged specifically in the state of Maharashtra, and which needs to be mentioned here because this led to the justiciability of rights-based employment guarantee programs, was Maharashtra's employment guarantee scheme. Among the series of public works program implemented by the government under the anti-poverty decades, the state of Maharashtra's EGS stands out for its firm roots in the rights-based framework. EGS came into existence in 1972-73 during a severe drought year to address rural unemployment. It was unique because under its provisions, the rural poor did not have to wait for government bureaucracies to evaluate their situation of distress and generate social programs for them. The rural poor could actually obtain unskilled manual work on demand whenever they felt distressful situations were happening. The EGS is an example of the emergence of the rights-based public works program. It aimed to provide employment and create community assets in rural areas. The Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Act was passed in 1977 and made the relief-oriented social program into a rights-based one. The EGS enshrined right to work as guaranteed in the Constitution and anticipates the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and Act MGNREGA 2005 and MGNREGS, which is the subject of an entirely different module. We have a module on MGNREGA and MGNREGS, which would inform you in great detail about this new generation of rights-based public works as it is getting implemented in the country today. Let us look at some of the learnings from the Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Scheme. It was initiated in 74 after the drought. It became an act in 77. It provided a minimum of 100 days work with several entitlements such as worksite facilities and unemployment allowance. These innovations have been incorporated in the new generation of public works program, that is in MGNREGS. Primary objective was to provide gainful, productive employment not just in rural areas but also in C-class municipal councils. The secondary objective was to contribute to the development of rural economy through strengthening rural infrastructure. Gains from MEGS includes alleviation of seasonal distress, protection against shortfall in consumption, preventing acute distress and costly forms of adjustment undertaken by rural households. Rural poor who lack credit and unemployment insurance, EGS acts as a social insurance. This is essentially meant that people did not have to sell their land, cattle, jewelry, household goods and their own labor and get indebted, but instead work on a government public works program and earn temporary wages so that they could maintain their lives. It prioritized marginalized communities. It had an indirect effect on agricultural growth because rural people were not so poor that they were unable to invest in agriculture. It created an upward pressure on agricultural wages, which means farmers had to pay more to agricultural wage workers when seasons got better. It led to the emergence of the rural poor in Maharashtra, often attributed to MEGS as a political force and better able to bargain for their rights and entitlements. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act was enacted in 2005 to reinforce the commitments towards livelihood security in rural areas. The MGNREGA aims to enhance livelihood security in rural areas by providing 100 days of guaranteed wage employment in a financial year to every household whose adult members volunteer to do unskilled manual work. In the module on MGNREGS, we will discuss how much we have come from the early years of public works program to a law which guarantees 100 days of work to every adult citizen on demand, irrespective of the social category or the kind of economic situation the person may come from. This, in fact, is a way in which a targeted social program has actually become a more universalized social insurance mechanism for the rural poor. Rural public works, therefore, have an established history of success as an instrument that stabilizes seasonal shortfalls, and it has also been used for famine relief in the context of India and neighboring countries such as Bangladesh. Comparative studies in agroclimatically similar villages have shown that the rural landless poor living in villages where public work programs are operating have less variable incomes than those living in villages where such schemes were not being implemented. In effect, it has led to what we have been discussing all along about reducing and mitigating the risks that people experience from a variety of macro processes as well as household situations in conditions of extreme poverty. Assurance of employment in lean season may have long-term benefits because risk-averse rural poor households may become less constrained to invest in agricultural production. This would lead not only to agricultural growth and investment in agriculture, but also to regenerate the rural agrarian economy, which is absolutely essential if large number of people in the country are not to remain permanently in a perpetual state of distress. The additional income in the lean season may also reduce disastrous coping mechanisms such as indebtedness, distress sale of land amongst rural poor households. Public works programs have been utilized to address labor market issues in some countries that have emerged during economic reforms such as the structural adjustment programs in the 1990s, 1970s and 1980s to address the issue of the vast armies of unskilled workers who failed to find work as countries transition to capitalism. In many countries of Eastern and Central Europe, which went from socialism to capitalism, and therefore a large amount of unskilled workers were generated in an economy which could not absorb all the workers. Public works programs have also been used to address the problems of labor market in such contexts. With this, we come to an end of the module on the public works program. To summarize and revise some of the points that have been discussed in this module, let's try and understand the nature of public works program. Public works program has a very limited goal at the outset. When you look at it superficially, it appears that all it wants to do is to generate a temporary source of employment at very low level of wages for a group of distressed people, and so that they are not moved to take drastic decisions in their lives, and so that they are able to maintain their living and consumption standards. However, public works programs over a period of time have emerged as an effective instrument of social protection when it has been linked to participatory democracy and rights-based legislation, which has meant that impoverished people are converted from passive beneficiaries to active citizens who may use such forms of rights-based legislations to demand social protection support from government in the form of temporary employment, which public works program can provide. We have specifically looked at India's early experiments and experiences with public works program during the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s as part of the poverty alleviation projects, in which we have moved from early programs such as the NREP, the JRY, the RLEGP and the Food for Work programs, and we have seen how entitlements as well as the scope of the programs have improved and expanded from with every decade as newer categories were included, as new forms of social disadvantages were recognized, and as the number of people to be covered by such programs have also increased, while at the same time maintaining the two broad and very simple objectives of public works program, which is to generate employment and create community-based infrastructure which would be used by the local people themselves. We have concluded with the discussion of how the early generation public works program in India led to the emergence of a rights-based public works program in the state of Maharashtra, and which again led to the creation of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. which combines the ideas of constitutional normative ideals of civil, political and social rights and links it up with social protection strategies, and leads to the empowerment and greater voice of the rural poor and the marginalized in their own efforts at maintaining their living standards with support from the state. Thank you.